Hello, Katya. How's it going? Hello to all.
Hi, hi.
While we wait for everyone to filter in, let's have a chat about one aspect of culture which is coming up for both of us quite soon: lunch, food. What's
Yes.
on the menu today, Katya?
I don't know. I'm in Lisbon right now, so I'll probably try to get something that's, um, I don't know, a mix between traditional, but maybe I'll go a bit more modern and trendy and fancy. I don't know.
Okay. Are
I
you
haven't
a
decided yet.
menu deal deal kind of person, or do you like fancy cafes with
I do like
more options?
fancy cafes every now and then, but I also like the more traditional, authentic stuff. Yeah. But I do, I mean, I like to have my latte. I don't necessarily want it to have a kitty drawn in foam or something like that.
Yeah, important as well. All right. Well, hi to everyone who is out there watching. We've got 15 people or so already. So, if you're here, just say hi. Tell us what you're eating for lunch, and we'll get started and tell you about cultural awareness in a little bit. I'm trying to think. Yeah, today Thursdays are a good day for me. It's like a going out for lunch day, so
Mhm.
that's nice. It's I always go to the same place that has like a set menu, so it's good because you don't have to decide what you're going to eat. And yeah, it's a good place in my neighborhood that I meet up with a few friends. It's usually world cuisine, which is kind of different for Spain. I guess typically Spain has these menú del dia options of your starter and your main course, and then dessert and coffee. But yeah, it's often like I can't remember what it is today. Maybe Indian food, something like that. One of my favorites. Great. Okay, let me just have a quick look in the chat. Great. Keshra is here. Hi, welcome along. Hope you are enjoying the day. Let's get started and introduce my guest for today, Cátia Lima, content writer, culturally aware person. Welcome.
Thank
Can you let
you.
everybody know who you are and what you do?
Yes, so I work as a content writer and also a ghostwriter. And I also have a blog, which was actually the start of my career as a, well, officially, well, as a writer. And that's where the blog was where I started getting requests from, basically. Um, in my blog, I started focusing, especially in the beginning, on Portugal beyond Lisbon, hence the name, Beyond Lisbon, because there was so much attention. It was when we started having this touristic boom in Portugal, and so many people were just paying attention to Lisbon, the Algarve, and Porto. And it really annoyed me a little bit, I have to say. So I decided to, that my blog would not change the world, but at least change some views. And then with time, I've adapted the type of content that I share there on the blog. And right now, I've been focusing a lot more on aspects of Portuguese culture and especially through one thing which I love, which is music, and how music can help us understand, in this case, another culture. Not just for people who want to visit the country or have any interest in the country in general, but also for people who are living here or wanting to live here. So,
Great, really interesting. Maybe you can give us some musical recommendations later. Were you born in Lisbon or outside of Lisbon?
yeah, I was born in Lisbon. At the time, most people who lived in the suburbs were born in Lisbon anyway, because there weren't a lot of people. Neither a lot of people living in the suburbs, not as much as we have now. Not a lot of hospitals in the suburbs as well. So yes, I was born in Lisbon, but I never lived in the city. I
Right.
studied in Lisbon. I worked in Lisbon. I've never lived in Lisbon in the city. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a kind of culturally interesting thing as well about like in the English speaking world, when we say a city, it really means much outside of that city, if you know what I mean. If you say I'm from Manchester, it means like the city of Manchester. Whereas, when I've been around the world and people say I'm from Buenos Aires, and I'm like, oh, cool, I lived there. And they're like, no, I'm from like 4 hours outside of Buenos Aires, in the province of Buenos Aires. I guess someone might be able to prove me wrong, but we don't usually have the same names for like cities and states and bigger counties and things in the English-speaking world. So it kind of confuses us when people say, oh, I'm from Madrid. It's like you're actually from Guadalajara or something that's close to Madrid, but not
in Madrid. Yeah.
Oh, right. Well, today we are going to talk about cultural awareness and how that can help writers to win new opportunities. If you don't know who I am, then I am a English writing coach. As you can see, I help multilingual writers with their English, their language level, with some aspects of the writing business. And yeah, culture is important to me for that aspect. I'm always saying that it's a strength to come from a different background to being a native English writer, and I want everybody to be able to use it as a strength and get new opportunities. So it's great that Cátia is going to tell us a bit more about that. So that's the goal. We're going to talk about that. If you have any questions, just chip in and ask. It'll be great to answer them, and we'll aim to be done at least within an hour, because we know we have to go and eat our lunch. So first off, let's answer the most obvious question. What is cultural awareness? What is it according to you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to understand what are we talking about when we talk about culture. Okay, so it's not about, or in this sense, it's not about having a big general culture. It's not about being a cultured person. We're talking about the whole set of traditions, habits, customs, beliefs that are connected to a group of people. And that group of people can be seen from a geographical point of view. So we can talk about, for example, the Portuguese culture or the Spanish culture, or we can talk about the culture of a region within a country. But it can also be something that doesn't have that type of border, so to speak, that type of constraint. It can just be a group of people. I don't know. We can talk about people in, cultural traits from people in Lisbon whose parents were migrants from other parts of the country. It can be a lot of things, but it has to do with this idea of a set of beliefs and traditions and habits and basically ways of, living and seeing the world around us. And then it's not about, or not necessarily about being politically correct. That can be a side of it, especially today when I feel so many of us feel like we have to really measure our words, especially online, because, as a friend of mine once put it, the internet is the mother of all misunderstandings. So, but that can be one side to cultural awareness, but it's much more than that. So it's about actually trying to understand how other people, live, how they view the world, and why and how they do some things that they do, which to us can be confusing, or we don't understand why. As we were talking a bit before we started, why do people in France eat snails and frogs? I'm guessing, at one point in history, people were starving. There was a really bad crop that year, and someone thought that maybe, if I add some seasoning, it will eventually be tasty. And oh well, it's better than starving to death, right? But it's important to understand this type of thing instead of just criticizing and saying, "Oh, that's horrible. I would never do that." Yeah, sure, maybe you will never do it, but it's important to understand why this happens, how did this type of behavior start, etc. And there's also another side to it, which I feel is very important, especially today, which is the fact that we as humans, I think we tend a lot to divide the world in terms of complete opposites. We have a tendency to see the others around us in terms of good and bad. And if you don't think like me, then you're a bad person. If you're not with me, you're against me. And there's a lot of gray between black and white, right? So, and cultural awareness helps us uh, to understand that. And as writers, we have a privileged means to convey that, and it's also an added skill, I feel.
Yeah, so many interesting things coming out of that. Yeah, I mean, with culture, I guess my thoughts on it are we live in this world where people are more mobile. They can live in other countries fairly easily, especially in Europe, and travel between them. And culture is something which exists outside of the simple barriers of language and nationality. I think people often say, "Oh, that's French culture, that's Indian culture." It's like, well, culture, as you said, can move between generations, between nationalities, between people from different backgrounds. So it's high time, I think, that everyone in the world started thinking more on a cultural level and less on a discrete level of nationality and age and stage and stuff like that. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. And even I live in a fairly international city, and the typical things that people ask is like, where are you from? And it's like, why are you asking me that? You just want to pigeonhole me. And if I say I'm British, you're like, oh, you like tea, and you're very introverted.
Immediately connect the stereotype. Yeah.
Yeah, so not always the best question. Maybe we should.
Yeah, but that's one interesting thing which I see a lot. Especially, I live in Sintra. For those who don't know, that's like very close to Lisbon, and it has become a very touristic area, especially in the last, I don't know, 15 years or so. And I see so many people. I mean, today I don't think it has ever been this easy to travel, right, as it is today. And I see so many people going to, in this case, Sintra, or even in Lisbon, anywhere that's touristy. And I see so many people going there just, they want to do what's stereotypical, basically. And they want to go to a monument and just snap some photos, snap something that would look good on Instagram, but they don't really do an effort to try to understand a bit of the place that they're visiting. I know sometimes, you don't have a lot of time, etc., but there's a general pattern of behavior that I see. Meaning, people travel a lot doesn't mean they actually understand the places they visit or actually make an effort in that sense. So,
Yeah, very good point. Because you work with a lot of writing and topics connected to tourism or travel or long-term stay, right? I
yeah,
think tourism doesn't always align with understanding culture.
yeah. It should help in that sense, I feel. But yeah,
Okay, so now we.
Anthony Bourdain says something like that. Sorry. Just he said something like that. Like travel is not a reward, but I can't remember the exact quote, but it was in the sense of preparing you for life, not as a reward for something. And that's how I see it, because yes, it also it makes your life richer, basically.
Yeah, totally agree. So now we know what cultural awareness is a little bit more, paying attention to different cultures and maybe being more inclusive rather than separating people. How can that help multilingual writers? And for anyone watching who doesn't know what I mean by multilingual writer, typically it would be someone who writes in another language than their first language. Often that's English, because English is the biggest market and makes up the majority of the internet and such. But yeah, a lot of writers from all over are using English, even though it's not their first language. They can be great writers. How can that help? How can being culturally aware help them?
Well, in several ways. It can be simply an added value, let's say, like an added layer. For example, if you're writing fiction, it doesn't even have to be on a content level. If you're writing fiction, you can, it's something that you can add to your characters, to your plot, to make it more, rich and interesting. But if you're writing content, um, it depends. Either you can talk about or write about the culture that you belong to, the culture you were born into, or you can talk about someone else's culture, which can be done, can be a bit more complicated, but can be done. It can also, and it should also, as writers, we should bear in mind the culture that we are writing for and how we can adapt what we're writing for that culture. Sometimes we don't know exactly who it is that we're writing for. I think this is something that a lot of writers can relate to. Sometimes we ask the client, well, who's your target audience? And they'll say, oh, it's everyone, just everyone. That's not exactly
The
how it
internet.
works, right? Yeah, the internet, just do your blog and stuff. In that case, and sometimes it does happen that we have a very broad audience. In that case, I think it would help to think not in terms of what you can add, but more in terms of what you shouldn't add, things you have to avoid to make your writing, to get your point across without touching very specific cultural aspects. So there will be a larger group of people um, in your readers. If you're writing about the culture that you were born into, then that's definitely an added value, especially if you're writing for travel, tourism, lifestyle, because again, it's it allows you to go above and beyond stereotypes and the obvious and what everyone else writes and what things like ChatGPT can give you, right? You can say that, let's imagine you're Italian and you can, any Italian, virtually, I'd say any Italian writer can write an article about how people in Italy eat so much pizza. It's something you can find across the country. Anyone can write that, even I can write that, and I'm not Italian. But if you can use those cultural aspects, and if you are born into that culture, you can go into a lot more detail and say, well, yes, but pizza is not the same everywhere in the country, and there are some differences between what you can eat in a restaurant or you can make at home. And then there's this other difference that, this time of the year we add this type of ingredient, but then in this other time of the year we add some other types of ingredients. There are a lot of layers of information that you can add if you're writing about your own culture, the culture you were born into, let's put it this way. But it's also how you, like I said, it also influences how you adapt your writing to the culture you're writing for. Like, for example, let's imagine you're writing for, or in my case, not you, but in my case, I'm writing for people who have English as their first language. Yes, okay, so that's one level, right, of culture. But then who are they specifically? Are they mostly people from Great Britain or Canada or US or Australia? And all of that will add layers of information, of cultural information that can be used in the text, like the type of idioms you use, for example, the type of thing they will have a bigger interest in, or something that I don't want to say triggers, but in that
Resonates,
sense,
maybe something that resonates with them.
yeah, yeah, yes. And all of that is information that you can add to your text. So it's something that works both ways. You can use it, you can add those cultural elements to your text, but that also is something that allows you to adapt your text to your audience.
Yeah, maybe we'll get into the specifics of what we can include culturally and what we might avoid culturally in a text. That would definitely be an interesting one. But yeah, just to sum up and touch on what you said, because it was a deep answer, because there's so much involved in this topic. I've got three kind of points I want to make. One is that, yeah, as you said, it's about both the culture that you can put into a piece and the culture that you approach from readers. And that's a strength that many native speakers don't have. because in the English-speaking market, in the Anglophone countries, we're so used to consuming video and articles and novels and stories and content in English, that we're not very culturally aware of the kind of content that comes from outside of it. So as writers, we might not be as good at approaching those cultures. And then added on top of that, I think if you are someone who has got a kind of unique viewpoint and experience where you have moved from one place to another or experienced some kind of incredible or traumatic event in your country, like that is, again, an experience that many native writers don't have. So those are the advantages that I see, whether you're writing about your own country or something else. So let's why don't we get into that a little bit more, Cátia, because you started talking about what does it mean to add things into a text to make you culturally aware or to avoid things in a text. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it depends a lot on what you're writing. Let me think of an example. You're writing about, let's say, for example, I'm writing a text about Lisbon, right? It's the capital, and then especially today, there's a ton of information that you can look up online. You don't even have to have been to Lisbon to write a text about it, technically speaking. However, there are many things that you can draw from your own experience or someone else's experience, people that are close to you. Like, for example, you can add, in this specific case, you can add that, like, for example, talk about the demographics, how the population of the city has changed. Like, for example, there were a lot of people in the mid-20th century who moved to Lisbon from other parts of the country, and what did they bring? How that changed the city, and it changed in several ways. For example, in terms of food, in terms of language. You can be, still today, although not as much, but you can be in Lisbon and you can be talking to someone like the elderly owner of a shop who has an accent from Min, that's in the north of the country. But this is something that you can, that's the type of information that you gather from your own experience and from having lived in the place or near the place. That's one layer of information. You can also talk about, so little known things, let's put it that way. But also, I think it's very important to pick on things. Could be, I don't know, food. We're talking about food just a bit ago, or behaviors or anything that people from other cultures will find odd, and explain why, the reason behind those things. How did they start? How have they evolved over time? If that applies. So it's basically all of these layers of information that you can add. Let me think of another example. We talked about food, about demographics.
I suppose just to comment on that, Cátia, like the kind of information or factoids that are like shareable, that make writing go not necessarily viral, but be share worthy. That's what we're often looking for in like what makes your skill as a writer valuable and text valuable. And if you have these personal examples, personal stories, or these points of difference between cultures that are shareable and that pique people's interest, that is definitely something that will benefit you.
Yeah. But it also involves, as writers, it also involves, I really wanted to reinforce this aspect. It's not just about, if you're writing about the culture that you were born into, it's not just about writing from experience, because you also have to do research. You need to be, especially, for example, if you have to mention historical events, you really have to be 100% sure of what you're saying, not just from what you may or not remember. You really have to do research. And quite often that research will also give you even more information than you were expecting to get. And when I say research, it's not just the first two things that show up on Google. Yeah, I mean really research. And this also applies to the culture that you're writing for. For example, Facebook groups, at least I find in my case, Facebook groups are a great way of seeing how people perceive Portugal, for example, whether they're tourists or living here. And that also gives you a lot of information and a lot of ideas of things that you can, topics that you can touch on, in your writing.
Good point. Like listening into conversations, but you can do that in a quicker way or a bigger way on in these groups and forums. Yeah.
If you don't know anyone from that culture personally, knowing people personally is always valuable. But if you don't, then I found that Facebook groups are a great way of getting a wide array of different opinions on any topic.
What kind of cultural awareness aspects should we avoid when writing text? What are some no-nos when writing in a more deeply cultural way?
I think maybe not totally avoid, but be extremely careful about them and avoid them unless you really have to talk about them. Anything having to do with, especially if you think in terms of European history, anything having to do with wars, dictatorships, that sort of thing. And, sometimes we have to mention them, but you don't really want to go into a lot of depth in those topics. Anything having to do with religion as well. I feel like religion, for example, is a very touchy or delicate, not touchy, delicate topic. For example, here in Portugal, we still have people that are very traditional and religious, but that doesn't apply to all the population. So when we talk, for example, about Easter, that's just coming up, Easter, you'll find people across the country having these religious processions and all of that. But how does that actually reflect how religious people are in their everyday life? And it's important, for example, to mention this sort of thing, all of these nuances when you're writing about, in this case, the culture that you were born into. It's easy to go to the stereotype and say, in Portugal, you won't find people doing egg Easter hunting. You won't find Easter bunnies. You do, but not as much as in other countries. So it's important to mention this sort of thing. Yeah. So
Yeah,
again,
avoiding.
regarding topics, yes. Unless you really have to go into a lot of detail, just mention them. And it's because what I feel like is that if you it can be very tricky to rein if you're going to talk about, for example, you're talking about, let's imagine, German society today. At some point, you'll have to mention whatever effects the Second World War or the Iron Curtain still have in German society. But do you really want to go into a lot of detail about that? Probably not. So, because that would mean a big asterisk in the end, like in translations, when you try to translate a word, but then that doesn't really match, so you need to have a really big explanation at the end. So you don't necessarily want to go into those topics. Mention them, generally speaking, but unless you really need to go into that,
Yeah.
my advice would be to avoid it.
Stay away from Pandora's box topics like that, where nasty
Yeah,
things are going to
yeah,
jump out, and
because you're going to have to talk so much about them that it becomes a completely different topic.
and generalizations too. I think like you said, to generalize and say, oh, everyone in Portugal is religious. It's like that's the kind of thing that will upset some readers who aren't religious, even if it's true that the majority of people are. And I think you were asking at one point about how to hedge that information and saying, people might do this, using a lot of modal words like or it's probably true that, using a lot of these qualifying statements. And I think sometimes better than that is using one example. If you give the
Yes.
example of a particularly, religious, old market trader in old Lisbon, it's like if we give that example, you're not saying that's the stereotype of everyone. You're not saying everyone is like that. You're just giving the reader, like you're showing them, this is a guy, and I'm using him as an example for the reason of telling you that, you know, his culture is quite applicable to Portugal, maybe, but it's not everyone. So using these examples, I think, is a good idea.
It should be starting with, in most cases, generally speaking, it adds a lot more interest. Although, I mean, we can use them, but
I guess, like with everything in writing, you have to use things a bit, or in, what's the word? With caution. No, just use them sparingly so that, you know, people don't notice these techniques being used all the time. My next question is about, so this event is called Using Cultural Awareness to Win Writing Opportunities. Could you talk about what opportunities you have won, you have gotten because of your super culturally aware attitude?
a super culturally aware writer. In my case, what has happened was that adding this layer of cultural awareness has allowed me to have not not necessarily more writing, works, jobs, but better ones. Because, like I said, it becomes an added value. You still have to be a good writer, but you're adding something that it's not easy to have. That it's something that your clients cannot really go on ChatGPT and get something that good. So that's like an added skill that's very valuable. And if you can use it properly, especially this day, like I said, this day and age, with all the traveling, all the and still so many stereotypes going around, it's definitely an added value and something that will contribute to people having more information and more accurate information and more detailed information as well concerning, in this case, a country. Although this can be applied to many other things. In my case, this is what has happened. It has allowed me to have better working, writing jobs, but also invitations, which is always good. It should be. It's not going around, knocking on virtual doors. It's like a different level, kind of an upgrade, so to speak, to your writing.
It's a ready-made niche, isn't it? It's putting yourself in the top 20%. I mean, that's a number I've plucked out of thin air, but I like to think of this Pareto principle, you know, the 80-20, 80% of writers are generalists. And, you know, it's the kind of thing that ChatGPT can do, you know, knock up a quick article about pizza in Italy. It can do that. So you've got to be in that top 20% of people who you're the only person, you're the best person to write that article. And if so, the value of what you produce rockets from base pay levels to you're the only person that can deliver that. So that's definitely highly recommended for anyone listening or watching this who is thinking, you know, how can I improve the value of what I write? Use what you have. You've already got all of this culture embedded. Seek those opportunities that use it. Maybe let's touch on AI now. I had an interesting chat with Matthew Zane the other month. He writes a lot about Armenia, and he was talking about being a non-native writer himself and using AI to help him build more culturally aware articles for audiences. What do you think about that? Can AI be helpful as well
Well,
as
first of all, we have to,
culturally
sorry.
clueless?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to define what are we talking about when we talk about AI. Is it something? Are you talking about software that can help you, and then, or something like ChatGPT? But regardless of that, I think that ultimately we have to remind ourselves that AI essentially knows what we let it know, right? It knows what we feed it, I think. And how, although, yes, to some extent, I think there are cultural aspects that you can get from ChatGPT or AI in general. But in most cases, I think there would be the stereotypes. It's because, for example, if you talk about a country's culture, or it doesn't have to be a country, a region, or a kind of ethnic group, or something like that, there will be many small aspects that ChatGPT cannot, or AI in general cannot pick up on. Like, for example, language. You know, like I'm sure that if I ask ChatGPT to give me examples of Lisbon slang, I'm sure they will give me some, but not all of them. I'm sure they would not be. I'm pretty sure they would not be able to reproduce a dialogue that could happen in a cafe in the suburbs of Lisbon between two elderly gentlemen, for example. And this is the type of thing, again, details and this first-hand knowledge. Yes, to some extent, I believe AI can provide some aspects in terms of cultural awareness, information that we can add, but it doesn't substitute the person who was born into that culture, for example, or the person who was born into one culture and knows very well the culture they're writing for, etc. So there are a lot of details there that I don't think AI can completely fulfill. I don't think so. It's the human aspect which so far I think they haven't managed to get yet there
I
yet.
wanted to maybe comment on the culture of the internet. Maybe we can get into that in a minute. Does that have its own culture? But just touching on AI, I tend to agree that we should remember the suggestions that ChatGPT et al. Gives are based on the most common answers. So it's good for general stuff of just like the very basics of localization, like just make sure that I haven't put my foot in it or said something which is outright wrong, because 99% of the articles that the AI is passing is telling us that is wrong. So I think for general things it can help, and I'd suggest using it as a tool, as a step in your process of if you've got a text which is designed for an audience which is in Scotland, you could say, could you just check this and make sure there's nothing untoward or nothing incorrect? As for the value that you add into it as a writer, yeah, obviously it's better if you have that personal experience and that deep knowledge of what makes Scotland Scotland. Spoiler alert, I think it's not liking England very much. That's my experience. I love Scottish people. It's got my sense of humour, and I used to live there as a kid, so I can say that. Don't
Yeah, but humor is one aspect, and I think AI cannot really, replicate like things like irony and sarcasm, even because they won't be the same everywhere.
Well, I mean,
I wonder if ChatGPT could have the level of sarcasm of an old Portuguese lady. I doubt it.
speaking about personal examples as well, I can give one about what I mean about Scotland. It's obviously England and Scotland have had their wars and troubles and conquering, and now it's kind of part of the same country and kind of not. And that goes back historically, but how that manifests is, I remember going to a pub in Edinburgh to watch a rugby match, and the Six Nations is a big rugby championship, and they, in every pub in the city, they have the flags of all Six Nations, but not England. So they come and watch the Six Nations, and it's 5 flags. It's like, that's the level of banter, and that's the kind of dislike that comes from history. But it's a kind of playful distaste, I think. So yeah, it's not the best place to watch England matches in Scotland.
Yeah, but it's true. And that again, I mentioned. I think I mentioned history a while ago. History is something that's sort of situation. And in Europe, we have so much of that, right? But that's kind of the kind of aspect that it's difficult to for AI to capture and replicate.
Yeah, here's an interesting one from Kasha. She says she finds Hallucinations problematic. Yeah, it's not even
Yes.
hallucinations anymore. I think a lot of AI is just outright lying. Like I've seen one sort of
Yeah.
say, how many M's uh, are there in the word Canada? And it will confidently say there are 4 M's in Canada. And you say, no, that's wrong. How many M's are in Canada? Oh, there are three M's. It can answer as if it's fact, but it's just making it up some of the time. Yeah, interesting one. I think Paul had a comment too. Let's just put that on. Oh, yes, this is interesting. Perhaps by definition, you're hedging here, Paul, perhaps. Culture exists only in the streets.
I wouldn't say that much. The streets actually are obviously an important factor, but I would say only in the streets. No, 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 no,
I think we're in this
not
period
at
of
all.
transition where we are moving towards a trackable digital culture. I think with everything that exists online that's archived, we will be able to track and trace it. There'll be internet historians in 100 years looking back at the origins of a lot of behavior and culture. So yeah, I'm not sure I fully agree with that. It's definitely important that we're connected to the physical world culture. But I think memes are a good example of internet culture which can be traced back to one original source, and they spread and develop in a way which a meme is so complex, actually, how it's written, formed, changed, and new aspects are incorporated into it in just a couple of words. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's too complicated for the likes of AI to understand. Although there's data that it cannot process. Shouldn't say it's too complicated. ChatGPT is much smarter than I am. Great. All right, let's ask another question. Let's move on. We talked about AI. Maybe we can move back just to round off. Actually, we're not going to move back. Let's round this off, and then if anyone's got any questions, we'll get to those at the end. How can we become more culturally aware? How can writers build cultural awareness?
Well, um, again, it depends. Are you talking about? Well, not it depends. It has to do with your aim. Do you want to be more culturally aware of your own culture or someone else's culture? In any case, research, talk to people, um, and depending a bit on exactly what you have to do, I would say being updated is also very important. For example, if you are writing about, I don't know, about your own country, but aimed at a specific audience, you have to be updated into what people that from that audience know about your own culture and what they expect, what their questions are. So researching and being updated, those are, I would say, the main two pillars of being more culturally aware. And it's also a question of going into the whys and hows of things like behaviors or anything really. I'm thinking in terms of traditions, but not just that. And even in language, this applies. And how did things come to happen? What was their origin? What caused them to happen? That's very important when you're writing about either your own culture or someone else's culture. Because again, you can say, "Oh yeah, eating beans on toast is part of British culture." Yeah, but everyone knows that. But how did it begin? What did want someone look at a can of baked beans and toast and say, "Hey, I'll just mix both," because, or was it because it was something that was cheap and filling, and if so, when did it begin? Exactly where was it? Something that started in one place and then spread to the whole country and the whole culture. It's the sort of detail that's interesting going into, that will definitely add that extra layer to your writing.
If anyone out there knows the history of beans on toast, tell us. We're quite interested in it. One question I've got about it is like, what? It's an American company, Heinz, and they're the by far the most popular brand of baked beans. But I don't think people in America eat baked beans, or
I
not so
don't
much.
know.
So,
Yeah,
like,
I don't
how
think
did it
so.
become such a thing in Britain?
But it's interesting. I think it's interesting to know, for example, that people in Malta still will occasionally eat beans on toast. So it's something that was it still is so deeply ingrained in British culture that it's still part of the culture of other countries where the British used to be.
Yeah, I mean, to talk about what you were touching on there with how to improve your culture, I would add two things. One is to appreciate that culture changes. It's really interesting to look at the whys and the whens of deep-rooted traditions, but things which change, like food, is a great example of fusion food changes, and you might say, "Oh, Italian." Food is, or let's say Spanish food, like paella is classic Spanish food. Well, hang on, where does rice come from, and where does saffron come from, and when did this start? It's not native to that
Yeah.
land, but it's deeply rooted as part of their culture. So things change, and some countries are very anti-change to their food, like putting chorizo in a paella is a no-no. But some countries are more open to it, and
Yeah.
that's an interesting point. So culture can change is one point I'd make, and the other is when you are doing research, do it in a deep way. I write a lot of
Yeah.
stories about places that I've never been, but I do research in a rich way. So I remember writing a story about an Indian restaurant, sort of in a Rajasthan or something. I've never been there, but I watched a lot of YouTube videos to get a feel of, like, what does it look like, what are the sounds they're like, what are the colors like, just more than what food is typically eaten in Rajasthan, India. That's the kind of research that you can get from text, but do rich research of, like, sensory information. I think that's important too, for getting a real picture of culture.
Yes, definitely. It's not just about that first level of research, like really get to know things and get as much information as possible. Yeah, video is a great way of doing it. In some, depending on what you're researching into, but yes, video is a great way of doing it.
Great. Okay, I'm looking through the comments here to see if we've got any questions. If you've got a question, just drop it in the comments. I think lots of people were commenting along the way, but not so many questions. If you've got one, now is the time. Maybe I can ask one final question to you, Cátia. Where can people find you online? And what would you like to talk about or plug before we leave?
Well, you can find me on several places, but I would advise going to beyondlisbon.wordpress.com, where you'll find not just the blog posts, but other places, the links to other places where you can find me, including YouTube. Um, and what else would I like to say? I think this cultural awareness topic is incredibly important. I think I first started being, you know, awakened, so to speak, to this when I studied Portuguese and English culture in the university, and it's something that we can. When you really think about it, it's something that can be used in other areas, not just writing. We're talking about writing because we're writers, of course, but uh, it's something that I feel makes our lives much richer, and it's something that we can apply to a lot of goes on in our daily lives. And also to anyone who might be watching this and not necessarily working as a writer, but in other areas. I'm not sure we mentioned that, but other areas that are also important when it comes to cultural awareness is, wait, santinho, we say in Portuguese.
Thank you.
Would be translation and localization. for example, in voiceovers, it can give amazing results. We had one great example of that in Portugal in the 90s, but that would be a longer talk. Voiceovers that we did in Portugal for Dragon Ball Z, they were so epic that people still remember them. And they use, my point is, how did they use cultural awareness in this? The dialogues were adapted, not just merely translated, they were adapted, and they also added different accents to the characters, like from different parts of the country. So I think this is a topic that's incredibly vast, and it can be a very welcome, added layer to anyone working today, especially if you're self-employed and have to do that extra bit of work to, do things, differently from working for a boss. You know what I mean?
Thanks for that. If anybody wants to know more about Dragon Ball Z or any other interesting blog topics, head over to Beyond Lisbon. .wordpress.com, you said it was? Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, final thing for me.
There will be a new blog post today. Sorry, there'll be a new. Yeah, I wanted to have it posted today, but the formatting wasn't cooperating with me. But there will be a new blog post today.
All right, new one dropping soon. Great. Yeah, final thing from me is I would add, if you want to improve your understanding of people from other places and get in touch with a bunch of writers, come and join us in the multilingual writers community. Cátia is a member, many people from all around the world. The doors are currently closed / ajar. There's a waiting list to join, but they will be open soon. If you want to know more about that, you can head to my LinkedIn page or my website, englishwritingcoach.uk. Thanks everyone for coming so much. If you've got any more questions, just drop them in the respective chats of wherever you're watching this, and I'll try and get back to you. And feel free to reach out and get in touch with either Cátia or I, or me.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for being a guest today, Cátia, and I'll see you around.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.